Mel, can you hear me?
Yes, Jeff, I can.
I got a message from a student asking me for the ID and password to get into the event. That's not something they need, is it?
If they registered, then no, they should have automatically received a link.
Okay. I'll email the student really quickly and let her know. Thank you.
Yes.
Lots of students. That's really awesome, Jeff. You must be an amazing professor.
I give a lot of extra credit.
Hi, everybody. I can see the audiences, the seats in the audience are filling in. It's really wonderful to be joined by people, as we're seeing in the chat room, from really quite, near and far on what here in the North Country is quite a beautiful May night. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you for tuning in, especially to this evening with Jefferson Hall, Clarence Jefferson Hall, the author of A Prison in the Woods, Environment and Mass Incarceration in the North Country. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors of this evening, the Keene Valley Library and Bookstore Plus in Lake Placid, amazing partners in this effort. I'd also like to thank Jane Hawk, who will be moderating, Melanie Redding, who is the sort of mastermind in the background with all the tech stuff, and Vanessa Banty, way over in the Boston area, who has been, Jeff, I think you'd agree with me, one of the sort of motivating and catalyzing forces in bringing this event together tonight. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to those of you in the audience. My name is Martha Swann. I'm the director of John Brown Lives. For more than 20 years, we have been excavating the freedom and human rights history of the region, working to engage communities and effect positive social change in our region. And I think it's safe to say that in our lifetimes, there is no issue of greater, no more pressing or present human rights and racial justice issue in the North Country than that of mass incarceration and the consequences of the Rockefeller drug laws in particular. These are issues that Jeff will address. He addresses in his book and that he'll engage us with tonight. I want to say a special thanks to Jeff because he's a consummate historian, professor, and ally in this work here in the North Country. Um, Before I turn it over to Jane Hawk, our moderator, I want to encourage everyone to check out the website of John Brown Lives. Oh, I guess I didn't even introduce myself. My name's Martha Swann. I'm the director of John Brown Lives, which is a freedom, education, and human rights project here in the North Country. Please go to our website, johnbrownlives.org, to see the upcoming events that we have this year as part of our ongoing season of events, but also 125 years of the John Brown Farm State Historic Site being a state acquisition and in the care and trust of the people and the state of New York. And support our work. Find our donate button wherever you can. Become a member of our Solidarity Circle and make a monthly contribution that will help sustain our work. That would be really, really appreciated and go a very, very long way. I'm going to introduce Jane Hawk, who holds a certification in mediation from Community Mediation Services in Queens, New York. She's certified by the International Institute for Restorative Practices as a facilitator. She earned her certificate in social justice mediation from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and has been a volunteer with the Correctional Association of New York since 2013. Jane sat on the Diversity Task Force at SUNY Plattsburgh under Dr. J.W. Wiley and sits on the Keene Diversity Advisory Committee while organizing the North Country chapter of Showing Up for Racial Justice. Her her project, Wake the North Country, coordinates lifelines to Solidarity, supports incarcerated men at reentry, helps people prepare for parole hearings throughout the parole, excuse me, through the Parole Preparation Project, and works to bring court-involved youth to employment on our beautiful Adirondack farms. She's facilitated town-wide conversations and issues around race and developed diversity inclusion trainings for public and private institutions in the park. She lives and breathes this work. She's a dear and beloved friend, and I'm happy to turn this evening over to Jane and to Jeff and to all of you to weigh in with your questions as the evening goes on in the Q&A feature. Thank you all.
Hi, thank you, Martha. That was an amazing introduction, and so I'm going to get started because Jeff has an amazing presentation for us. I'd like, first of all, just to let everyone know that I'm coming to you from the Adirondacks, which is unceded Haudenosaunee land. If you want to put into the chat where you are, we would love to know where you are. It seems like people are coming from all over the place. We're going to use the Q&A for questions. So the chat you can use however you like, but the Q&A is where we will be looking for questions to pose to Jeff once he's done with his presentation. Everyone is muted if you're an attendee, so the best way to communicate is through the Q&A. Okay, I would like to introduce Jeff. Jeff Hall grew up in the North Country and is currently an assistant professor in the Department of History at Queensborough Community College, Keene, and visiting in
Sound.
Jane, we just lost your volume.
Now, can you hear it now?
I can hear you.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. Okay, where was I? He teaches courses in early American history, New York history, environmental history, and environmental justice. His research focuses on the intersectional histories of the environment and incarceration in the US. Jeff's first book, A Prison in the Woods, Environment and Incarceration in New York's North Country, was published by the University of Massachusetts Press in November of 2020. His work has appeared in Adirondack Peaks, New York History Magazine, Environment and History, Process, Edge Effects, and The History Teacher. Additionally, his research has been featured on CNN, MSNBC, NPR, CTV News, and the New York Times. In a variety of other media outlets, you can find him in other places as well. He's currently working on a new project that we may talk about in the end. I'm very curious about. Whatever Jeff is working on is always really fascinating and interesting. So I'm going to turn it right over to Jeff so he can get started. Take it away, Jeff.
Thank you, Jane, and thank you everyone for coming. My name is Jeff Hall, as has been pointed out. My pronouns are he, him, and his. Before I begin, just like Martha, I want to thank the folks at the Bookstore Plus in Lake Placid and the Keene Valley Library for sponsoring tonight's event. I'd also like to thank my dear friend, Martha Swann, along with her counterparts at John Brown Lives, Jane Hawk, Melanie Redding, and Vanessa Banty for helping make this event possible, and it truly was a collaborative effort. Finally, I want to thank everyone watching and listening for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this talk. In particular, I want to say hello to my students from Queensborough Community College, who I've never met in person, but it's nice to have you here. And good luck, because final exams at CUNY started today. I hope everyone finds my talk both interesting and informative, and I look forward to answering your questions at the end. Excuse me. We're just going to advance the slides here. There's my contact information. If anybody wants to get in touch, if you need that later, I can provide it. This is a map of the region in New York State that I'm going to be talking about. For the past 16 years, I've been working on the environmental history of incarceration in the US, with a special focus on New York's North Country. During that time, I have had many opportunities to share my work and ideas with others. Upon hearing of my interest in this topic, the reactions of people unfamiliar with either me or my work have often contained a mixture of befuddlement, confusion, circumspection, and sometimes a furrowed brow. Nevertheless, for every person I have confused, there have been others, in many cases total strangers, who seem to immediately understand and appreciate the value of my work. One encounter in particular has stuck in my memory. I was taking the Long Island Railroad to Penn Station one day in the early 2010s when an older woman took the seat next to me. We started talking, and in the course of the conversation, I shared with her the topic of my research. What followed was a richly rewarding chat where I felt both seen and heard. As we were leaving the train, this 80-something New Yorker turned, pointed her finger, and instructed me, "You must turn this into a book." Hardly ever one to disobey my elders, I did just that. I'll talk about the book more in a moment. First, though, I want to revisit those folks I told you about earlier, the ones seemingly perplexed by the idea that prisons and the environment could be connected. I get the confusion. After all, for how many people does the word environment conjure images of a prison? By the same token, prisons don't exactly match with the chirping birds, leafy trees, and babbling brooks that, for many, represent the environment. If the apparent intellectual chasm separating prisons and the environment were the only source of confusion, I could respond easily by saying, "You're wrong. Prisons and the environment are connected. Read my book and find out." But the roots of both the confusion and the chasm run deeper. With some exceptions, popular culture in the US has presented an image of prisons as isolated and self-contained environments that exist seemingly outside any fixed geographic boundaries. Think of all the episodes of Law and Order, where the police and prosecutors visited Dannemora, which you can see here on the map right there, which I'll talk about more. The name of Clinton Correctional Facility, the maximum security prison there, prominently displayed on the screen. The studio standing in for Clinton on Law and Order could have easily represented any prison anywhere in the country. While but one example, it speaks to one of the central themes of my book. While many Americans may have been conditioned to believe that what goes on inside a prison has no impact on the world outside, and vice versa, the history of prisons in New York's North Country shows that this has never been the case. While the ties binding prisons and their environments may be unknown to many people living today, they were crystal clear to the public officials who planned and built them in the Adirondacks. Beginning in the 1840s and continuing through the 1990s, the environment was a pivotal factor in the planning, construction, and operation of prisons in the North Country. We'll start in the Clinton County village of Dannemora, which in the early 1840s was an unnamed, uninhabited spruce forest, home to exactly one human-built structure, a long abandoned ramshackle hunting cabin. At the time, New York's two existing prisons, Auburn and Sing Sing, were dangerously overcrowded, prompting state officials to begin planning a third. But prisons cost a lot of money to build, operate, and maintain. State leaders thus decided their next prison had to be financially self-sufficient. The environment of central Clinton County proved attractive because of its extensive untapped supplies of iron ore, which state officials surmised could be mined by imprisoned men and sold to private manufacturers and consumers. The fortunes of Clinton State Prison, opened in 1845, were thus irrevocably linked to the natural world that lay both behind and beyond its walls. We'll come back to this in a minute. However, the environmental transformations unleashed by Clinton's construction were not limited to the mining of iron ore. The decision to build in the middle of a largely undeveloped wilderness meant that everything the prison needed in order to operate had to be built from scratch. To overcome this significant challenge, lawmakers withdrew 20,000 acres of land surrounding the prison from sale, cordoning off local water, timber, and mineral resources for prison use only. Imprisoned men were enlisted to help build the prison itself, using locally cut stone and timber to erect a wall, cell blocks, and mining infrastructure, all of which you can see illustrated in this image. And this image, as you can see, is from 1869. There really are no good images of the prison from that very early period. This is probably the best one. To ensure the health and safety of people living and working in an often harsh and unpredictable climate, incarcerated workers installed amenities, largely unfamiliar to most Americans at the time. Indoor plumbing via a network of pipes connected to a nearby spring, and an unusually sophisticated, for that time, indoor climate control system. Nevertheless, in a region as sparsely populated and remote as Clinton County, the new prison would never achieve self-sufficiency without modern infrastructure beyond its walls. Many incarcerated men thus found themselves outside the prison, cutting trees for fuel, construction materials, and perhaps most importantly, the building of roads, connecting Clinton to nearby communities and rail depots. And many roads, if you visit Clinton County today, many of the roads in the area around Dannemora still exist and were originally built by imprisoned men. As the population of both Clinton and the surrounding village of Dannemora, which you can see here in this image, as the populations grew in the 1850s and 1860s, the prison generated significant environmental ripple effects as local farmers and entrepreneurs cleared new planting fields, erected new homes and businesses, and entered into increasingly lucrative business deals with the prison. And this is one of the themes I sort of emphasize in the first chapter of the book, is that at times it was hard to really tell whether this was an industrial workplace or a prison. The lines really did blur. Unfortunately, revenues earned from the sale of prison-produced shoes, nails, farm produce, and other goods neither matched nor exceeded the enormous costs incurred from constructing the facility, thus preventing Clinton from ever achieving financial independence. So in terms of the state's initial plans for the prison to be financially self-sufficient, that never happened. The costs of building the prison were simply too high. However, the experience of building and operating Clinton during its first 2 decades taught state officials an important lesson, namely that the value of prisons and poorly paid incarcerated workers extended far beyond their ability to incarcerate. Correctional institutions, state leaders learned, could be used to jumpstart far-reaching environmental and economic transformations in their host regions. And the construction of Dannemora and Clinton proved that. Armed with such knowledge, lawmakers would have little incentive to reduce the state's increasingly heavy reliance on imprisonment as a form of punishment. Fast forward to the early 1970s. New York was facing an economic death spiral. Traditional industries across the state were shutting down. Rising joblessness exhausted state unemployment and public assistance funds. Those who could fled the state in search of jobs and economic stability in the South and West, taking their increasingly precious tax dollars with them. A diminished tax base meant smaller budgets for schools, parks, and other public services and infrastructure, imperiling the quality of life, health, and safety of all New Yorkers. For those unable to move, the future appeared grim, as more and more New Yorkers struggled to meet the basic requirements of everyday survival. As has always been the case, the burdens of societal and economic collapse fell heaviest on New York's people of color. Just to survive, many began turning to unlawful activities, and soon the state's urban centers, where most of New York's people of color lived, were gripped by increasing rates of violent and non-violent crime. Coming on the heels of the post-war civil rights movement, the crisis of the early 1970s prompted a harsh
Jeff, I think you've tuned out. Lost audio for a second there.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm going the wrong way. How am I now?
Excellent.
Excellent.
Okay, sorry about that. Should I start over?
No. Just start at this screen.
Okay. Coming on the heels of the post-war civil rights movement, the crisis of the early 1970s prompted a harsh conservative backlash. Appealing to the same racial hysteria that characterized many white reactions to the achievements of the civil rights movement, in 1973, Republican Governor Nelson Rockefeller signed into law a package of amendments to New York's Narcotics Control Act of 1966. And this image here from the New York Daily News is from Governor Rockefeller's State of the State address in 1973, where he first announced plans for this package of amendments. The Rockefeller drug laws, which Martha referenced earlier, as these amendments came to be known, mandated long prison sentences for the possession and/or sale of minuscule amounts of a variety of controlled narcotics. With many impoverished people of color participants in New York's narcotics trade, and with all being susceptible to police corruption, state lawmakers all but guaranteed the mass imprisonment of Black and brown New Yorkers. The only remaining question.
I can still
Can you hear me?
I can still hear you.
Okay.
Mel,
Does anyone else have?
Can we ask people who are attendees can everybody just put in the chat whether you can hear Jeff and me? Audio's working. Okay, keep on going, Jeff.
Okay, sorry. Okay, the only remaining question before state officials after passage of the Rockefeller drug laws concerned where this increased population of convicted men would be imprisoned. This question acquired heightened urgency in 1975 as New York's 32 prisons approached full capacity. Efforts to locate new prisons in the New York City suburbs met stiff resistance from residents concerned about property values and public safety. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many of the affluent suburbanites who opposed the placement of prisons in their backyards were also fervent supporters of the very drug laws that made new prisons a necessity in the first place. Increasingly desperate for new cell space, correctional planners looked northward, hoping the Adirondacks could once again help alleviate overcrowding in New York's prisons. However, the North Country of the 1970s in no way resembled the sparsely populated wilderness of the 1840s. A region that had long been remote and inaccessible now boasted dozens of communities populated by year-round residents and second homeowners that was also popular with tourists. In addition, a panoply of environmental laws enacted beginning in the late 19th century meant the unrestricted and unregulated environmental transformations witnessed at Dannemora in the 1840s could not be repeated, or could they? Time and again, environmental laws and regulatory agencies many assumed were guardians of public and environmental health proved unable to stop potentially hazardous prison construction projects from reaching fruition. Consider the case of Raybrook, and you can see Raybrook on our map here, right there in Essex County. A small hamlet in Essex County, 6 miles west of Lake Placid. To alleviate overcrowding in the state's other prisons in September 1976, Democratic Governor Hugh Carey unilaterally converted Raybrook's former state-run tuberculosis hospital, which you see pictured here, as a minimum security prison. The governor took this action without waiting for a legally mandated environmental review of the project by the Adirondack Park Agency. The Adirondack Park Agency, or the APA, founded in 1971, is empowered to regulate building projects in the interest of environmental and public health on public and privately owned lands inside the Adirondack Park. Though its power to regulate projects on state-owned properties like Raybrook's former tuberculosis hospital were limited to its non-binding advisory review, meaning the prison could open regardless of the APA's recommendations. This episode demonstrated a significant weakness built into one of the state's most important environmental laws, namely that the state government could effectively sidestep its own environmental regulations when building on its own land. While the state's conversion of the Raybrook complex to a prison ultimately posed little harm to the nearby environment, the same could not be said for the federal prison that opened directly across the road. Governor Carey's conversion of Raybrook's former TB hospital was the culmination of a month-long struggle for control of the massive 540-acre residential institution that had been built in 1904 and closed in 1971. In addition to the State Department of Correctional Services, the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the Lake Placid Olympic Organizing Committee had also expressed interest in the property. The facility's abrupt conversion as a state prison left unresolved the housing dilemmas facing the Bureau of Prisons, which was struggling to build new cells for an increasing population of men in federal custody, and Lake Placid's Olympic organizers, who needed a single location in which to house roughly 2,000 athletes and coaches expected to participate in the 1980 Winter Olympics. With an assist from local Republican Congressman Robert McEwen, the Bureau of Prisons and Lake Placid's Olympic organizers hatched a plan to build a brand new facility on an undeveloped piece of land across the road from the state prison in Raybrook. This new complex would solve both bureaucracy's problems by serving first as Olympic housing and later as a federal medium security prison. Unfortunately, no one seemed to know who owned the property that was chosen for construction. Maps held by different state agencies told different stories. Some said it was privately owned, while others claimed it was state property. To clear up the confusion, the Adirondack Park Agency exercised another of its powers and reclassified the tract as state land. This move, however, exposed the project to a potentially long, drawn-out, and legally binding environmental review by the State Department of Environmental Conservation, something neither the BOP nor the LPOOC wanted. Once again, the APA intervened, arguing for a federal takeover of the property. It was going to become a federal prison after all. That would eliminate the possibility of any state environmental review, now or in the future. So in effect, one of the state's environmental regulators was taking steps to actively avoid this project undergoing environmental review. The tract's May 1977 transfer from state to federal ownership for $1 all but sealed its environmental fate. Given a free hand to do as they pleased, federal contractors began tearing down 75 acres of Raybrook's forest in June of 1977. After feeding the cut timber into wood chippers, they proceeded to excavate, as you can see in this image, 1 million cubic acres of earth in order to flatten the terrain, which was a requirement of the Bureau of Prisons when building new federal prisons. Heavy rains in August and September of 1977 washed hundreds of tons of unsecured wood chips and mud into nearby bodies of water, harming wildlife populations, damaging critical habitat, and befouling local fresh water supplies. So there's one of the direct consequences of there being no environmental review. Nearby residents vociferously objected, but there was nobody to turn to. Even the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, claimed it had no jurisdiction over a project being built on federal land, arguing Lake Placid's Olympic organizers were responsible, since the project would first house Olympic athletes. The environmental damage was only remediated when the federal government threatened to withhold workers' pay and funding that was necessary to complete the project in time for the Winter Games. And the project was completed, which I'll show you, was used to house Olympic athletes and still operates as a federal prison to this day. The opening of 2 prisons in Raybrook outside established environmental legal frameworks underscored the degree to which prisons posed risks to the North Country environment as great as those unleashed at Dannemora during a period when there was no environmental regulation back in the 1840s. The experience of Raybrook also taught state leaders a very important lesson, namely that state environmental regulations were no barrier to opening prisons inside the Adirondack Park. This was a particularly valuable lesson as the need for new prisons did not end with Raybrook, as the ever-increasing state prison population only deepened Albany's interest in building prisons in the North Country through the 1980s and 1990s. However, the experience of Raybrook also taught residents and homeowners an important lesson, namely that preventing potentially grave prison-induced harm to environmental and public health would require grassroots resistance. Unfortunately, local residents' arguments against building prisons often reflected their own class and racial biases. This proved especially true in the Franklin County hamlet of Gabriels, after the state proposed converting another old tuberculosis hospital as a minimum security prison in 1981. While members of Citizens Against More Prisons in the Adirondacks, CAMPA, the group formed to oppose the prison in Gabriel's, members of this group successfully pressured the state to include most of the new prison's property in the state forest preserve and thus protected from development. This goal was achieved primarily through correspondence laced with racist vitriol directed at the prison's new occupants. And this is one example of about 100 letters that were sent to the Adirondack Park Agency shortly after the state began planning the prison in Gabriel's. And you can read for yourselves the disgusting language contained in the letter. But this is just one example. Damage to woods and wildlife, it seemed, were not quite as important as preserving Gabriel's prevailing white and wealthy demographic profile. Echoes of CAMPA's unsuccessful campaign to stop the prison in Gabriel's could also be heard in the Franklin County village of Tupper Lake, where for nearly 2 decades, town officials determined to bring a prison to the community squared off against residents and nearby homeowners equally determined to prevent such an outcome. In the 1980s and 1990s, members of Tupper Lake Concerned Citizens, the group formed to oppose the siting of a prison in Tupper Lake, deployed racially coded messages designed to stir fear in the local population, including warnings about the possible spread of HIV/AIDS and the potential relocation of imprisoned men's family members to the community, which opponents anticipated would mean higher taxes to fund increasingly scarce public assistance programs. While TLCC used tactics similar to those employed by CAMPA as part of its campaign to prevent a prison from opening in Tupper Lake, it was ultimately a previously undisclosed threat to local fresh water supplies and not TLCC's racial hysteria that scuttled plans to build a prison in Tupper Lake in 1997. And this was actually the last time there was an attempt to build a prison inside the Adirondack Park. I want to end by talking about the racial dynamics that have structured the conflicts over building prisons and their place in the North Country environment. From the 1970s through the 1990s, both opponents and supporters of the prisons deployed racially inflected environmental arguments to defend their respective positions. While many who resisted the opening of prisons claimed the Adirondack Park could only be used for outdoor leisure and recreation by white and well-to-do people like themselves, those who favored bringing prisons into the park often asserted that the Adirondacks was the best possible place to incarcerate men led astray by the chaotic forces of city life. And that's a very old argument going back to the 19th century. However, as I showed you earlier, in many cases, local prison opponents did not bother to couch their racism in environmental terms. While prison critics generally confined their racist sentiments to private correspondence mailed to government officials, which they may have assumed was remain secret until the end of time, prison supporters and their allies have usually taken fewer pains to conceal their true feelings. Anyone who has spent time in the North Country knows this. While the Confederate battle flag and other white supremacist symbols have become ubiquitous across the North Country since 2016, this is nothing new. I'll relate some personal experiences to illustrate. I grew up in the North Country, as Martha pointed out, in the 1980s and 1990s. My father, who is right here, if you can see my little arrow moving, that's my father, worked as an officer for the Department of Correctional Services and retired from Clinton after 25 years of service in 1998. So his career overlapped with the era of mass incarceration in New York State. The local prison industry was, no big surprise, a big part of my family's life. I remember hearing prison employees casually use racial slurs to describe incarcerated people. I recall hearing folks refer to the buses used to transport incarcerated people to and from local prisons as the African Queen. While working at a local convenience store when I was 17 years old, a regular customer who came in for coffee every morning would, as he was stepping out the door, tell me that he had to go and, quote, pick up his load of coal. Only after asking my manager, because I did not know what he was talking about, did I discover that this man ran a taxi service ferrying the family members of incarcerated people from the Plattsburgh bus terminal to the prison in Dannemora. That was the outside of the prison when my father retired. I put his name up on that sign. Finally, not far from where I attended high school in Saranac, New York, there was a cemetery containing the remains of local men who died fighting in the Civil War. When I was in high school in the late 1990s, Confederate battle flags began appearing on the dead soldiers' headstones. While these are just a few examples, they illustrate an important element of the North Country environment, white racism, that is as powerful a force as any river, mountain, or storm that moves through this area. Without the presence and labor of incarcerated people of color, the North Country, a place seemingly steeped in racism, could not function. I'll just show you a couple pictures here. And I apologize in advance for the quality of the images. These are taken from scans that are online. I had a lot of difficulty getting the originals, which is a different story. But these are images of incarcerated men who were held at Raybrook at the state prison, who helped build the Ice Palace in Saranac Lake for the annual Winter Carnival. And there's one image from 1978 and then another from 1980. And again, I apologize for the quality of the images. Finding images like this is not easy. For decades, many men incarcerated in local prisons have been active participants in an outdoor work program run jointly by the Department of Environmental Conservation and Department of Correctional Services, which is now called Department of Correctional Services and Community Supervision. In towns and villages across the North Country, incarcerated men have completed a variety of vital public works and conservation projects. Among other undertakings, they have assisted with flood control, soil conservation, firefighting, and storm cleanup projects. They have built hiking trails, ski trails, campsites, and even venues used during the 1980 Olympics. They've also refurbished scout camps, government offices, schools, churches, and libraries. They have done this work for sometimes as little as $1 per day. It is next to impossible to live in or visit the North Country without touching the handiwork of imprisoned men of color. But how have these workers and their labors been acknowledged? Have they ever been honored as the builders and keepers of the Adirondacks that they have been and continue to be? The commemorative landscape of the North Country is chock full of memorials to conservationists, like this one here, which I'm sure some of you have driven past near Whiteface Mountain, tablets marking the 50th anniversary and centennial of the creation of the Forest Reserve. Military strategists like Benedict Arnold, who has his own plaque along the shore of Lake Champlain. And even creatures that don't exist are honored with their own commemorative markers. But where are the monuments to the young, impoverished Black and brown men caught up in a wave of racial hysteria that dropped them in the mountains and forests of the Adirondacks? Why is this part of local history seemingly not worthy of recognition? Why is it so difficult for so many to talk about this? I hope that in time, the environment that incarcerated people built and continue to build in the Adirondacks will be as recognizable to residents and visitors as the region's many lakes, rivers, mountains, and prisons.
Thank you,
I just
Jeff.
want to wrap up. Oh,
Are you done? Are you, I didn't want to interfere. Go ahead.
oh no, you're good. I was just going to say that's the end of my comments, my remarks. I just wanted to ask everyone if you are able to purchase the book. Of course, your support is greatly appreciated. Even more appreciated if you could purchase from one of our local booksellers, one of the sponsors of this event, the Bookstore Plus. If you're ever in Lake Placid, they have copies on the shelf. They also deliver nationwide. You can order directly from their website. And if you order from them and want to send the book to me, I will inscribe it for you and pay for the mailing costs. So, and I'll put any author's name you want, mine or someone else, no charge. So thank you very much for listening.
So thank you so much. That was fascinating, Jeff. And I highly recommend the book. I finished it a couple of days ago. I also just wanted to say something about language. A lot of people still use words like inmates or felons, and it was really wonderful to hear that consistent language saying incarcerated individuals or incarcerated men, just to try and humanize people. And off of that, I would ask of an initial question, which is about the idea that you've just put forward around acknowledging the work that incarcerated people have done throughout the history of the park, and whether that's a way that you see to humanize them or bring them forward into the narrative. I think in the North Country, we have two narratives. One is that these are violent people, and the other one is that they're helpful people. And in the book, there are lots of examples of small communities who praise and are very thankful to people who are incarcerated doing work there. So can you speak to that a little?
To how we could,
I'm asking you
I just want
about,
to make sure I'm answering you correctly.
yeah, I'm sorry. I'm asking about the idea of acknowledging the work. Is that the way you think it would be best to humanize them, or do you have other ideas about how to humanize and break the narrative around the violent felon?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think certainly one way to humanize them is to, yes, commemorate the places that they built. Because I think what we have in the Adirondacks, and I think you can find this in every state, you look at maps. I showed you all a map of the Adirondack Park and the prisons in the North Country. What those maps don't show you are the places that incarcerated people built and rebuilt and refurbished and renovated. You might see a map of the Adirondack Park when it was created in 1892, and it might show you the blue line and the various boundaries where the forest preserve is and where private land is. But the maps don't show you the heavy investment made in incarceration in this area and the extremely difficult and dangerous work incarcerated people have done to keep this place in existence, right? So I think that very basically just telling people when they're traveling, this ski center was refurbished by incarcerated men. This lean-to was built by incarcerated men. This riverbank was stabilized by incarcerated men. I think people humanizing them, that's one way to do it, is by just showing people when they're traveling, wow, right? The prisons are not these remote institutions. They've had this huge impact on the community. But I think another way to humanize them, and maybe I'm stepping a little bit away from your question here, is to just pay them a decent wage. If you're going to put them to work, don't give them $1, right? That's unacceptable. And I've run into people, and I still do, who tell me, well, they're in prison, they don't deserve to be paid. So I'm like, oh, so you're endorsing slavery. I thought we did away with that. So if the state is going to require people or even ask people to do work, they should be paid appropriately. I think, and that should be public knowledge. That this, I think that, I think back to my own experience growing up here. I really never knew all that much about the various jobs that incarcerated people did in the area. I mean, it was a very well kept secret. And I read the news. I was one of those kids that read the newspaper and watched the news when I was like 7 years old. So I knew what was going on. So I think that just increasing public awareness of the extent to which incarcerated people of color have contributed to conservation and preservation, I think that's really one important way of humanizing incarcerated people, so that people aren't just focusing on whatever offenses they might have committed, but actually acknowledging and being grateful for the important work that they've done and that they continue to do.
Yeah, that's great. I'm being asked to ask people to put their questions in the chat, because I guess there's stuff going on. I mean, in the Q&A, sorry, in the Q&A, not in the chat. Please put questions in the Q&A. I have a question here, which also really brings what we're talking about forward a little bit more. It says, I was just wondering if your investigation also included the attitudes of the working poor whites in the area, for many of whom the prisons have been the main employment in the area. So the book absolutely does that. We're coming back again to this question of this narrative that people who work inside corrections need to put forward, that they are doing a very important job, which is keeping dangerous, violent people away from the rest of us. And so I think that that happens in the book somewhat, but I'm wondering if you could speak to that sort of dichotomy between, wealthy people and poorer people, or middle class people who work inside, and maybe even what's happened in your own family around that issue.
Okay. I would say that the person who asked the question, thank you for the question. That's definitely true. That, and if you read the book, as Jane pointed out, in each chapter, I go through sort of how prisons were received in each community by people from different demographic groups. So from working class whites, from wealthy second homeowners, from tourists, how each of those groups reacted to the idea of building prisons in these communities. So definitely do look at that. I think it's correct to say that in general, in each community, there was a pretty sharp dividing line between second homeowners and tourists being against the prisons, and the local working class population generally favoring them. Though one important point that I think is sometimes lost in all of this is that when we talk about environmental protection, this is often politicized, as I think everyone here is probably aware. Poor people don't want to breathe dirty air just as much as wealthy people don't want to breathe dirty air, and don't want to drink dirty water, and don't want to see garbage on the side of the road. So one point that I would make is that at times when it was either proven that prison construction had posed a threat to public health or environmental health, or could pose a significant threat, the working class could be brought around to oppose a prison construction project. So there are nuances here that we have to remember. Also have to remember, Jane asked me about my family experience. You know, my father worked as a corrections officer for 25 years. I have other family members who work in that same industry. Nobody I've ever met who works in corrections likes working in corrections. I'm sure there are some people who like that job, and if they do, more power to them. If they find fulfillment in that profession, that's great. My father hated his job. The relatives I know who work in Clinton hate working there. I'd say, quite honestly, it played a role in destroying my father's life, and played a significantly harmful role in our family. When you give a person 3 months of training for a job and then send them into a maximum security prison, ask them to participate in violence, put them in there for 16 hours a day, with the promise of a high salary and benefits and all of that, that's going to take a toll. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but you don't have to be to really put those pieces together. So I would definitely say that every family that's implicated in the prison industry in the North Country approaches this differently, but I would say there are some general patterns that I was able to identify during my research and based on my own experience.
Thank you. And thank you for the question. I forgot to thank the questioner. She also asks if there are other resources for people. And now I have 2 questions about other resources for learning more and raising public awareness.
About the connections between environment and incarceration?
Well, I think there's a sort of general feeling that people just don't know that that's how it works in prisons, that people are making 19 cents an hour to do work, right? And they aren't paid. Like, how do we raise awareness? And for people in the chat, in the Q&A, who are looking for resources, I would say your book is a great resource. Are there other ones that you think they could access?
Yes, there is a whole literature, in fact, on this topic. What is called carceral studies. It's really become a significant subfield in social sciences and humanities, I'd say, over the past 15 years. And there is a very large and growing literature on the central place that incarceration plays in the development of American society. And if the questioner wants to email me privately, I can put my email in the chat here. There's a lot of comments here.
Or you can.
This is my email. Oh, to panelists, I'm going to send to panelists and attendees. So
please.
There's my email address. Anybody who wants to contact me privately, I'm happy to recommend texts that could help you learn more about this history, both in the US, but also there are some good texts about New York State as well.
Okay, there's some specific questions in the chat. One about the environmental impacts at Auburn near the Finger Lakes. Also a question from about working to close prisons in the area as a way of humanizing them and also helping the area interested in diversifying the area.
I can say something about closing the prisons for sure.
Can you, before that, also I skipped something about high school and college education in the prisons. My understanding is that Pell Grants went away.
They were restored.
They were restored. Yay. Okay.
Yeah. So
we're back to the
closure
about closing prisons and sort of raising general awareness and closing prisons.
I've been asked this question a few other times and I've been thinking about it a lot. So folks who are from the North Country or who know about the region know that 3 of the prisons up here have already closed. So the one in Gabriel's closed in 2009. The prison in Lion Mountain closed in 2011. And the prison in Chateauguay closed in 2014. Just this spring, the annex at Clinton Correctional Facility closed. So it seems as if the trajectory right now in New York is toward the closure of prisons. And New York had 70 prisons at its peak in the year 2000, and they're down around 50 now. So that seems to be the trend, is that the prison population is going down. The number of prisons is also going down. And I do think that we have to think about what's going to happen once the prisons are closed. I mean, it's a valid question to ask, because the state, and Jane, you may remember this from the book, and others who've read the book or are familiar with it may know, when the state was building these prisons in the 1970s and 80s, they repeatedly promised, we've never had to close a prison, don't worry, they'll be open forever. You'll always have your jobs, you'll always have your health care, you'll always have your retirement, nothing to worry about. That turned out not to be true. So I was talking to a friend of mine who teaches environmental humanities about just transitions, and he works on the energy industry. And we were thinking about, like, what would a just transition look like for a prison community, a place like Dannemora. Dannemora wouldn't exist if that prison hadn't been built. So if that prison were to close, what would a just transition look like? I don't know. I think about it a lot. What would a just transition look like for those 3 towns that have shuttered prisons just sitting there now, really of no use to the community? But also, what would a just transition look like for the incarcerated people who are either released, who were convicted of offenses that were created during a period of racial hysteria, right? Their family members, their neighborhoods. There are many people to think of who are not in the North Country, but who are part of this history. So it's a very good question. It's something I think about a lot. I've actually done a little bit of writing on it. So whoever asked the question, thank you, good question, and send me an email.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting questions that we had talked about before the program was about why somebody who didn't grow up in the North Country or isn't particularly interested in the North Country would want to read your book. And so I'm wondering how applicable what happens in the book, how does that apply to sort of generally in the United States, how incarceration came about and where prisons are placed?
I think that I was talking to a book editor, a book acquisitions editor at a university press about this recently. And I think that the book could be useful really for anyone in any part of the country, because I think it helps people understand that really no matter where you live in this country, you have been implicated in what is called the carceral state. I tell my students, for example, when we actually had classes in person, I would tell them much of the furniture at our college was made in a state prison. Even the little blue exam books that they took their exams with were made at a state prison in Watertown. So that prisons are not these isolated, remote institutions that you don't see or hear about unless you watch the news, or that you don't see or hear about unless you have a relative or a loved one confined inside one. We're all connected to this system, some more directly than others, but it's impossible to avoid the connection. And the connection doesn't necessarily have to involve just prisons. It can involve reservations where indigenous people were forced to move. It can involve mental hospitals where people were confined sometimes for their entire lives. It can involve customs that kept people's mobility and freedom limited. That even goes on today. So we're all part of this history. It may be confined to one geographic place, but everyone in this country is connected to this history in one way or another, both the history, but also in their own lives living today.
So another really interesting question that came up that I sort of answered off the side because it was there early was about representation and the census. And my understanding is that people were counted in the county where they were incarcerated, even though they were not allowed to vote. And so the North Country has a sort of overrepresentation in legislatures, both in DC and in the US, in Albany, because of the census. And yet, by and large, the North Country votes Republican and conservative, which might not be what people who are incarcerated would use their vote in terms of putting those people in. Is that still true? Or did that change very recently?
No, that's still true.
It is.
Incarcerated people are counted as residents of the counties where they are incarcerated. And this is something else I talk to people about quite a bit. If you are convicted of committing an offense, whether rightfully or wrongly, why do you lose the right to vote? Your voting rights seem to be really important. What goes on inside prisons, how they're administered, how they're run, is determined by elected officials. Yet as soon as you walk into a prison, you lose your right to vote. But you are counted as a resident, as Jane pointed out, of the county where you're incarcerated, yet you have no representation, either in the state legislature or in Congress or anywhere. I mean, so in a way, I just said that prisons should not be seen as these isolating and remote places. But for the people incarcerated in them, they surely are remote and isolated. And that seems really wrong. I mean, when you go into, when you're sentenced, when a judge sentences a person to a prison term, they don't say, oh, and by the way, you're losing your voting rights. You're going to be in a hole for 23 hours a day. I mean, all the other extra punishments that are tacked on that seem cruel, right? I mean, seem just unconstitutional in a way, right? But that definitely, yeah, is part of the political culture here, which, as Jane pointed out, is generally tilts conservative and Republican.
Yeah, I'm wondering if it might be helpful for people who are looking also for more things, if Mel could put in the chat a link to some other things. I'm just thinking about Brian Stevenson's TED Talk. We need to talk about an injustice. Are there other things? I'm sorry, Mel, to put you on the spot that way. Are there other things like that, Jeff, that you can think of that are sort of really educational and helpful for people who are just beginning to wrap their heads around incarceration in the US?
I'm trying to think of something that's not too academic,
Yeah.
that is accessible.
13, the new Jim Crow.
The new Jim Crow, I'd say, is a pretty accessible text. The book Blood in the Water by Heather Ann Thompson about the uprising at Attica. It's a very long book. It's like a doorstop, but it's definitely a captivating read if you want to learn more about the New York context for mass incarceration. A really captivating story. Highly recommend. I can make a list if people want to email me. I can make a list of texts that I would recommend. I'm sort of having a senior moment right now.
Yeah, it's hard when you get on the spot like that. So we're a little bit over 8 o'clock. And I'm just seeing Ava DuVernay's 13th is free online now. there's a graphic novel or graphic text based on Mark Mauer's book. Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes. Yep, I have
Um,
that.
I have one
Yes.
more. Oh, people. I think people are putting new questions in the Q&A. So Jeff has kindly offered to stay on a little bit past
Mhm.
our time. I'm wondering, I was looking at the picture with your father of his graduating class, and I was counting very quickly and found that there were at least a dozen graduates of that program who presented as being Black or brown men. In my time working, going in and out of correctional facilities, I've maybe met two people of color. Was there a decrease? Was there an increase? Do you have a sense of who's working in corrections and whether it's a more diverse job or a less diverse job than it was when your dad was there?
I'd say it's more diverse in the state system than it was, but it's still predominantly white. The city correction system is more diverse. The employee population there that works at Rikers Island and the other city correctional facilities is a much more diverse
People live.
group.
Yeah, you see people like
Yeah.
Washington. You see more people of color working at Washington Correctional because it's closer to Albany, I guess. Interesting.
Sure. Yeah.
We have another question asking about the economic equation with prisons and goods that are made there. I don't believe we have any private prisons in New York State.
No.
But
They're illegal in New York.
is the idea of self-sustaining, of a prison being self-sustaining, still alive in sort of the way people think at docks?
No, that idea, actually, that whole scheme was discarded by the end of the 19th century. But surely the prisons in New York in the 19th century operated like industrial factories. And that was the idea. Auburn, Sing Sing, Clinton, even Newgate Prison, which was in Greenwich Village, which was the first one, operated according to those principles, where incarcerated people were working on contracts for private entrepreneurs producing consumer goods that would then be sold for profit in people's shops. I mean, in the book, I pointed out in Plattsburgh, there was a shoe store called the Clinton Prison Boot and Shoe Company. That, I mean, it didn't even try to hide where the products came from in the 1850s. But that system is long since been discarded. What I can say, though, if people are interested, the federal prison in Raybrook, just like every federal prison in the United States, has its own factories. It produces goods for the US government and US military for profit. They produce stationery, envelopes, paper, counting pads. They produce supplies for the US military, uniforms, other type, not weaponry, but smaller equipment for the military. And those factories are required to earn a profit. So there is still some of that, but not in the state system.
Yeah. I think we had somebody in one of the questions who might still teach at Newgate in the city. Is it still open?
Newgate closed in 1839.
Sorry.
So
there's a prison that's called New something in the city, isn't there?
Well, there's it close to where, well, in downtown Manhattan, there's the Metropolitan Correctional Center. That's a federal detention center, high-rise prison.
Okay, I was thinking something else.
Okay.
Maybe as a Edgecombe. It's
right. Yeah.
Sorry, my brain slid in there somehow to new. There's a question here about John Brown lives and the farm. And maybe that could be one of our last questions. Just how do you connect the work that you do with the work of John Brown Lives and work that's going on at the farm in terms of things that happened this summer there, the memorial field and things. How do you connect those things together?
Well, I've known Martha since 2013, and I've attended many John Brown Lives events, and I'm happy to do my part to advance the work of the group. I would definitely say that John Brown, who's, for people who don't know on this call, John Brown is buried in Lake Placid. His farm is there. It's a state historic site, and John Brown Lives, Martha Swann's organization, has worked to increase public awareness of the site, which I confess as a child growing up, I did not know existed. And I grew up 45 minutes away. I would say that John Brown was an abolitionist, right? John Brown was somebody who fought for people's freedom. And I would say that I'm trying to do what I can to increase public awareness of the unfreedom that surrounds us in the North Country. And I think by educating people on how we got to this point, hopefully we can make better choices in the future. John Brown used different means to achieve his objectives. I use the tools that I have as an educator to hopefully inform people about the prison system in the North Country, how it operates, its impacts on poor populations, people of color, and what we can do to make the situation better so we don't make these same bad choices again in the future.
So an interesting question's just come up, and I'm going to put it in there because I think it's very apropos of what we're talking about right now and connects the work that's going on now with current issues. So the question has to do with Rikers Island closing and the opposition to the construction of small prisons within communities in New York City where people will be closer to family and things like that. So we're sort of looking at a very similar issue down in the city because if they had let that happen a long time ago, those prisons wouldn't have ended up in the Adirondacks, right? We wouldn't have seen the same kind of building. They would have built them closer to home where people are living.
Well, I think I just want to clarify one part of that for the questioner. So Rikers Island is a city jail. It's not a prison. So a jail is supposed to be a holding facility while a person is waiting to go on trial or waiting for a settlement with a judge. A prison is a place a person is sent to as a punishment for committing and being convicted of an offense. So the change that was described in the question, where Rikers Island is going to close and the population of that jail is going to be dispersed around the 5 boroughs, that's the plan, right? But those folks who will be in those new jails are not being incarcerated as a punishment. They're awaiting trial. Right. Though they wait so long for trial sometimes that it feels like they've been incarcerated, right?
Right. So part of the roadmap around criminal justice reform has to do with getting rid of cash bail. So people don't sit in jail because they can't afford to pay to get out.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess that question, I see someone said you can serve what they call a county year in jail. Like you can choose serving under a year or a year, you can choose to serve it in a jail versus going to a prison, but that's a very specific case, I think. So is there a conversation that would happen upstate in communities where prisons are closing that would happen downstate where these new jails are being built, is there any similarity in terms of saying people don't want people who they consider dangerous outside, right? They want to keep those people incarcerated, and they want to keep them away from the general population, free citizens. Are we back to the same conversation around humanizing people, or is there another conversation that needs to happen?
It seems like if this plan goes through, it's going to feel like the controversies I talked about in my book being repeated. I mean, you've already seen this because there have been public hearings in different parts of Queens and in Brooklyn where these local jails are being planned, and there's a lot of community opposition. Public safety, of course, is an issue. Property values is also an issue. So it's sort of these old arguments being resuscitated again. So definitely, I think once Rikers Island closes and the jail populations are dispersed, I think that yeah, you're going to see some of these same issues flare up, and could lead to some interesting political changes in the city. You know, the mayor's race this year could be interesting to watch.
So I'm going to just ask you before we close to tell us what you're working on now.
Well, I have a few different projects. I'll talk about the two that are sort of immediate, and then two that are sort of in the works. I'm finishing an edited volume of essays on the theme of war and imprisonment. So this will be a collection of essays by historians writing about the wartime experience of incarceration, and it looks at cases in Africa and Europe and North America. And that will be out by the end of this year, early 2022. I was asked to write a proposal for another edited volume on the intersectional history of environment and incarceration in the US. And this I'm working toward getting a contract with the University of Washington Press. I was contacted by an editor there a couple months ago, so I'm working on that. More specifically with the North Country though, I'm going to be applying for grant funding to create a digital map that details the sites of every place where incarcerated people worked, both in and outside the prisons.
Oh, wow.
That will be available online, and also hopefully have some kind of presence out in the community, like those historical markers that I just showed you, or an app that people could open on their phones as they're traveling and see as they're driving or hiking, oh, you know, in 1980, incarcerated people built this ski trail, or they built this cabin or whatever. So that's a project I'm working on that I've started sort of building a proposal for. And one other that I'm interested in is just healthcare in the prisons. The pandemic is shining a light on just what a dangerous place prisons are in terms of people's health. And I'm interested in investigating that more. And also, I just want to let your listeners know, in Dannemora, the local town ambulance, by local law, is not allowed to go and collect patients from the prison, right? So anytime somebody imprisoned in Dannemora needed medical attention at the hospital in Plattsburgh, they could not call upon the resources available in the town where the prison is located. So again, I mean, showing you this sort of complicated relationship. They can't live without the prison, but they do everything they can to make the incarcerated people's lives miserable, right? So, and that's part of the healthcare story of incarceration that I'm interested in looking at.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, I keep thinking, I have a friend who spent a long time incarcerated, and he's always reminding me the punishment is the time, right? That's what you
Right.
lose your freedom, and that's the punishment, and anything up
Yeah.
above that is really abuse. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Right.
So I want to close out and maybe just say thank you to Martha and John Brown Lives. I think that I'm hoping people will go on John Brown's Lives website and look at their calendar. There's some really interesting things coming up. And I don't know if Martha's still there, if she'd like to let us know what some of those things are. I want to thank you, Jeff, just for a fascinating talk and for your continued work. I'm really interested in the idea of marking places where incarcerated people did the work, because I think I hear you, and I had not thought about it until I read your book, that as long as things are hidden, people can decide not to see them. So I think it's a brilliant idea. So more power to you. Good luck with that. And I'll turn it over to Martha.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I can't hear you, Martha. You're still muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Jeff, for a riveting talk. Jane for moderating so beautifully. I guess just a couple of things in terms of events. As I mentioned earlier, this is the 125th year that the John and Mary Brown home has been in state hands. It was acquired officially on May 27, 1896. And so we feel like this is a history that I really didn't know about, that we don't really know about, that this is a history and a really seismic milestone in state history to lift up and to celebrate, to commemorate, and also, try to drill down and understand what is the long-standing connections around Black lives in the Adirondacks then and now. So one of the events coming up on around June 18th, we will be installing the Memorial Field for Black Lives, Ren Davidson Seward's new memorial field. Will be in and up for the whole summer. We're having Juneteenth observations on the 19th of June. And then, getting into the history, drilling down in some of the history of this 125th anniversary. I'm very, very excited. On July 4, Eugene Meyer, who is a Washington Post journalist who wrote a book called Five for Freedom about the Black Raiders who joined John Brown at Harper's Ferry, he's going to come up from DC and give a talk about the Black Raiders in particular. Aaron Mayer, many of you know, is an environmental leader, health leader from the Albany area, and now spending more time in the Adirondacks. He's going to read from the memoir of the only surviving Black raider, Osborne Anderson, who visited the farm on July 4th, 1860, just a few months after the raid. And then the last event I'll mention, although there are many, many others, is on July 17. We are having our delayed 2020 John Brown Day and presentation of our Spirit of John Brown Freedom Awards this year to Nell Painter, to Ellen Rocco, who was the longtime station manager of North Country Public Radio, and to Soulfire Farm, and also sort of a rededication of New York State acquiring this human rights destination, this sacred site. So go to our website, check everything out. Let us know how you want to be involved and help us, and let's give like a bravo and a great thanks to Jeff. Jeff, there's so many things that you mentioned, the restorative justice, connecting, that attends to both upstate and downstate communities so direly affected and differently affected, but by the carceral history of our region. the commemorative landscape. There's so many things that you mentioned tonight that you're working on and are interested in that I really do want to pursue with you and continue our work together. So I'm indebted. I think we all are indebted to your dedication to this history and its meaning for us now. So thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Good
Thank
night,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Mel. Thanks, everyone, for coming, too.
Thank you. Great students, Jeff.
Yes, they are good.